Well, good morning, everyone here in New York. And good morning, good afternoon, and or good evening to those of you that are watching us live on our web stream. Wherever you are in the world, we have a good number of people that are tuned in. My name is Adina Renee Adler. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Steel Climate Council. So good to see so many friends and familiar faces, and I have also met a lot of new friends and colleagues throughout the planning of this, and I am just delighted to have you here. I actually forgot to ask the Kearney folks in case of emergency. I'm not sure what our evacuation plan is, but we are on the 78th floor of the iconic Empire State Building, and I think it's just going to be a long walk down the stairs. I was not told about any fire drills and anything, but hopefully you all have good walking shoes on in case of an emergency. I am so delighted to welcome you all to this event, whether you're here with us or online. We are going to talk about forging the supply chain's decarbonized steel, which is to say that we're looking not just at the criticality of decarbonizing and lowering emissions of steel production, but also the mutual catalyst or the group effort that inevitably emerges where raw material and energy suppliers to steel production are also steel consumers. So the end result is that accelerated progress toward real holistic emissions reduction throughout supply chains and around the world can actually happen. So for those of you not familiar with the Global Steel Climate Council, in 2022, a group of steel producers and their partners across the value chain came together to make an ambitious commitment to the 2050 net zero goal as outlined in the Paris Climate Agreement. But their promises are not platitudes. Rather, they are transparent, measurable, and accountable oaths for real action towards both short-term and long-term goals. In short, our unofficial mission statement is simply cut emissions. There are something like 80 standards, programs, initiatives, and policies supporting steel industry decarbonization worldwide. But I can say for a true fact that we are the only program to combine corporate-wide strategy to set science-based short-term and long-term emissions reduction targets that eliminate a company's opportunity to focus on only one or two facilities with certification of product emissions intensity. Now, for the interest of time, what you're seeing is I actually have like 10 slides to explain this, and I condensed it into one, just for you to see this. And it illustrates on the left side a single technology-neutral glide path for corporate targets based entirely on the International Energy Agency's data points. And then there is like a slightly differentiated glide path for each type of steel product and their emissions because of the variability of the chemical composition for long and flat products and their requirements, but you still arrive at the same 2050 goal, as you can see, as set by the IEA, and that's of course the glide path that you see on the right. And with the combination of third-party audits and annual self-audits, we can see immediate results in product emissions reduction from the first years. And within the next few weeks, the GSCC is going to roll out better graphics and better storytelling where you will see our members, which some of their plot lines are already dotted on these charts, where you will see the early results of year-over-year emissions reduction. And you're not getting those results from any of our competitors. GSCC member success is happening because of innovation in steelmaking, and that's why we're here today to hear about one particular advancement in scrap recycling that is disavowing previous assumptions of production capability and instead accelerating decarbonization. But for the architects of the Paris Agreement and global leaders, including those gathered in New York this week, continuing to press for progress in the fight against climate change, it takes the effort of the collective, and there is much to discuss on how partners across the entire global supply chain can turn to science-based frameworks to stimulate decarbonization and be of mutual support to overall sustainability goals. So with that, I will introduce all of our speakers now and then call them up in turn. There are QR codes in the subsequent slides, so you can refer back to the agenda and to read everyone's more detailed biographies. Okay, so with that, and I realized that I had forgot to ask for control of the slides, so whoever's doing it, you're doing a great job. In a moment, so we can advance to the next slide. In a moment, I will turn the mic over to Kish Kamani, who is the America's lead for sustainability at Kearney, our proud partners and incredibly generous host for this event today. We will then hear remarks from Charlie Miller, a climate strategist for London-based financial services provider Legal & General, who will present the findings of a newly published paper, Forging Steel's Future, an expanding role for scrap in modernizing and decarbonizing the US and Europe's steel. Following Charlie's presentation, he will join our panel for a broader discussion on supply chain decarbonization. I will moderate that panel, and we will be joined by Dave Miracle, who is General Manager for Environmental Affairs at Nucor, North America's largest steel producer. And I will note that Dave serves as a member of the GSCC board. Mel Hirsch is Director for Partnerships and Consortia at the Nuclear Company, which is accelerating the cost-effective deployment of nuclear energy at fleet scale. And Nick Ellis is the principal with Amazon, managing their investments and partnerships for the $2 billion Climate Pledge Fund. I would also like to take a moment to honor the earth we seek to protect. If you have not already helped yourself, please do take one of each of our gifts that are laid out on the table near the exit. These gifts, or swag, SWAG, Steel with a Goal. These are thoughtfully curated for you. The GSCC certified low-emission steel encased in acrylic was made by GSCC certified member Steel Dynamics and is entirely recyclable. That's true. The electric arc lighter comes to you by GSCC certified member Nucor, which is a carbon-free energy source for you. Furthermore, not everybody has imbibed in the refreshments that we've provided for you, but I hope you will, and feel free to get up during the session quietly to get some more food and refreshments. But they are served to you on goods made from recycled, recyclable, or reclaimed materials, and with plastic waste at the barest minimum. Please note in particular that the cups, or the champagne flutes are actually made from reclaimed plastic that would have otherwise been bound for the ocean, and they are reusable, so don't throw those away. Anyway, with that, I'm going to stop talking, and would like to invite Kish up for his welcome remarks. Podium is yours.
All right, so good morning. Thank you everyone for coming, and welcome to the Kearney offices, and I welcome you on behalf of all of my Kearney colleagues here in New York and all around the world. We are expecting a very spirited and lively discussion, and in case you need more encouragement than the most this is a new space for us, so we're very excited to host you here. In fact, it's my first visit here, so that's why I was silent on the safety question. If you need help getting around, you're better off talking to someone. My name is Kish Kamani. I'm a 30-plus year veteran with AT Kearney. I started in the mid-90s, and actually one of my first long-term engagements was in the steel industry, where I helped a major integrated steel company with sort of an end-to-end transformation of operations and supply chains. So I have some history in the industry. I've also worked extensively in chemicals and plastics manufacturers, and I worked a lot in the energy and energy transition space, particularly in electric power. So it was very natural for all of those things to come together in my experience for me to work in sustainability. And I have the pleasure of leading our sustainability capability here in the Americas. I was initially drawn to Kearney just because of the ability and the opportunity to solve problems with some great people. And I can confirm that's still the reason that I'm here today. And love the firm that I work with so much. Kearney is really one of the pioneers of the management consulting industry. Tom Kearney founded our firm 99 years ago. We celebrated our 99th birthday last week, actually, with Kearney Week. So yes, we will be having an even bigger party next year for the centennial. But over that time, we've really developed a reputation for being analytically rigorous and pure, for really trying to drive pragmatic solutions for businesses and organizations that are going to drive results. And there's also this idea of essential rightness, which was a key value that Tom Kearney instilled with everybody, which is, of course, we serve our clients and we have to do right by our clients, but we also have to do right by our employees and by the societies and communities in which we serve. So that is foundational to us. It's been sort of in our DNA for 100 years. So it's only natural that we feel like we would take the lead in sustainability. We walk the talk ourselves. We were the first carbon neutral management consultancy 15 years ago, and we recently were the first to adopt science-based targets for our own emissions reductions. So that's our legacy in the space. We serve a lot of clients across all different industries in helping them with achieving emission reductions, circular business models, social justice, responsible sourcing, all sorts of things like that. So we're really encouraged and excited to host you today. Having worked in the steel industry, I have a pretty good understanding of how economically vital it is to the global economy, and also the challenges of sustainability of the industry, both economically and also for the environment. 95% of the emissions are in scope 1 and 2, so it is very much about solving a production problem. The bulk of that is in iron making or steel making. So it's very clear that technological innovation and technological advancement is going to be key as we move forward, which is why I'm really excited to hear about some of the things that we're going to do today. So thank you again. Please engage, and back to Adina.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. So with that, I'd like to now call up Charlie Miller of Legal in General.
I'll just say this slide. Morning, everyone. So take yourself back to 1930 when a delivery of steel was arriving 78 floors below us from Bethlehem Steel Company in Pennsylvania. Hoisted up here to create this amazing space, which thank you, Adina, and thank you, Kit, which we're presenting in now. Below on the street, there was a Ford Model T driving around the corner. No longer in production, but it's still a symbol of America's industrial might and innovation in the steel sector. If we click onto the next few slides. Now that was nearly 100 years ago. And at that moment in time, America was industrializing, urbanizing, generating a huge amount of value and economic wealth. But the steel sector in that period was also growing, and it was always innovative. And if there's one thing that you take from this chart, it's that technological change in the sector is constant. It's always evolving, but in an industry with long capital cycles of 50 years plus, it doesn't happen that quickly. One thing we can learn from history, in fact, is that the basic oxygen furnace came to the fore with an enormous improvement in technology, continuous casting, much better energy efficiency, and it completely wiped the floor with previous processes. So the industry has been through change before, and it can go through change again. But as we stand here in 2025, there's a new factor, a macro factor. I won't tell you what all of these different processes are. I don't have time for that. But there's an enormous factor which is driving the capital allocations of tomorrow over the next 50 years, and that's decarbonisation. If we come to New York Climate Week, it'd be weird if we didn't talk about carbon, but clearly that's what's going to drive the sector allocations in the future. So if we click onto the next slide, we stand with this choice. We have a sector that is bifurcating around two different technology pathways. One is a lower carbon pathway. Another is retrenching into past technology, trying to stop change and trying to stop that innovation over time. If you had to invest into a future, the greener one would be electric arc furnace steelmaking. And if we show that in data, the start picture, we've heard a lot about AI. That was one of the. If anyone managed to spot that one, you've got good spidey senses. So the same picture, but in data, shows you something that was really interesting to see. It was just when we started this project, we just saw this from the IEA. We thought it's so transparent that one method is much lower carbon intensity than the other. So clearly, if you want to take the sector on a pathway, a mixed shift is what is going to get you there at the current technological readiness levels that we have in the market. So clearly, I mean, this is really quite stark. It's orders of magnitude difference. But I'd also note there's other ways of primary production that are also significantly lower carbon. So if you were to bet on the pathway of the sector, you bet on American industrialization, American innovation, and new technology to take us there, rather than trying to retrofit our way to a decarbonised future. So if we skip on to the next one. Capital allocators in the sector, we're really interested in what gets funded today. And what's interesting is, as we look at this decarbonisation pathway that the world needs to go on from now through to 2050, 2060, to achieve our climate goals, and that's helpfully illustrated by the GSCC pathway here. We need this smooth glide path. We can see that capital is actually betting on that future too. So we see the global energy monitor capacity in construction and announced, and it shows that there is literally, I mean, the main thing here is there is literally nothing in the blast furnace or integrated capacity in the North American market. And that's largely a factor of economics, actually. It's not even carbon oriented, it's largely economics. But as you think about allocating capital, you also think about stranded asset risk. If these assets are 50 years into the future, they need to be compatible with these much lower emissions levels into the future. So capital is betting on this. If we skip to the next slide, it's important to recognise in everything around the climate debate and focus on the areas that are financially material. And what I put in here was just a reminder of the fact that climate is critical to the steel industry in terms of the financial performance that these assets will generate over time. There are parts of the market that really are being locked off to low carbon steel. And definitions here are really important, particularly in Europe. We can see automakers putting orders into the market and paying a green premium in flat products in the order of 120 to 170 euros per ton. Now that's an enormous economic incentive to grow that capacity, but there are reasons we can't. We'll come on to that in a second. There's cost efficiencies, particularly as we start to apply a carbon price, and an evolving business model, which is lower fixed capital costs, but more flexible in terms of responding to price signals. So as investors, we really do believe that there's an alignment between better financial performance and decarbonisation through the route of circular steelmaking. Actually, skip on to the next slide. So if it's so obvious and there's a clear pathway, why don't we move faster? Well, there's a number of reasons, and we address this in the paper that we've got Nucor. But clearly, scrap is not infinite. We are sitting in a building here which is 100 years old. It's an enormous store of steel, and actually, in the economy, the amount of scrap that's available is a feature of the past consumption that we've had. So over time, if you grow your production, if you grow your demand, your scrap can't keep up unless growth slows. Now, as we look at it in the US market, it's been a huge consumer of steel for the longest time. it's got this enormous scrap resource, which we assume needs to be maximised. But many of the decarbonisation frameworks in the market don't allow that as a decarbonisation factor. Clearly, we need a recycling infrastructure and logistics. This requires time, effort, and money. It needs to be recognised. And also we have technological development in terms of scrap quality, which Dave might talk to later, which allows us to make all the types of products of steel that we need, but with scrap as a primary design. So let's get on to the next slide. So as we investigated this, we wanted to investigate this. I mean, the main thing here, there's too detailed for now, but the main point is that this is circular. And so all of the primary iron making capacity goes into the market and gets recycled back at the end of its life. So there is a mathematical benefit to scrap supply that comes to the market over time. We skip on to the next. Now, many of these decarbonisation frameworks, I mean, you'll know many of them are responsible steel, SBTi, you have the GSCC, you have the low steel emission standards. Adina mentions that 84, I don't know this off the top of my heart. That's more of them than there are floors up here. But what's really driven the market over the years has been basically China's rise. And China's massive industrialization in the 2000s drove a doubling of steel supply over that period. And new growth and growth in demand requires primary production. And so China's growth basically was funded and forced by integrated steelmaking, which massively expanded the steel, but also the emissions of the industry. But remember that mathematical factor and that circularity. So all of that steel that's been put into the market today comes back to us in the future in terms of as raw materials that we can utilize in the construction. And as we modeled this out, we found that mathematical factor really is very significant. We've got about a third of steel today that's made through recycled processes, but that can expand really fast in the future as the primary steel demand, which is enormous today, tails off over time. What's driving that is really slowing growth, it's slowing population growth, and it's also this new supply of steel that's coming to the market. Now, what that does, and it's really critical for us today, because it means that if we build blast furnace capacity globally, we'll be locking in, firstly, overcapacity, which is bad for pricing, which is bad for investment, but we'll also be locking in emissions in terms of that capacity that's going to continue to produce primary steel that we may not need in the future. So what we're really interested in is aligning the primary production that's built today with that decarbonisation pathway in the longer term, so that we don't experience these risks of emissions lock-in and or negative pricing. That's also quite supportive of something that we see in the market, which is tariffs and regionalisation of the steel market. As we have a global overcapacity problem in the market, we've seen regions such as Europe and the US introduce trade barriers. What that does is it protects particular industries from the pricing pressure of this overcapacity globally, and it enables businesses to invest into decarbonisation with the protection of improved pricing in that period. So with the regionalisation of the industry, we have all of the factors that allow us to invest profitably into the transition. We skip the next slide. So America's half consumption becomes an enormous resource. Here we've modelled out what the steel stock in the economy looks like, and these are sort of the buildings and infrastructure which were built all the way through the 30s, 40s, 50s. The grid infrastructure, all of that is an enormous stock of steel, and much of that is coming to the end of its life. Similarly, Americans love cars. I could not believe how many there were in New York City when I arrived off the plane. It was a real shock to me. We have them in Europe, but not to the same extent. They are much bigger, and there's a lot more of them. And so it really was, it emphasized to me this green element is a massive resource for the US. One thing to note is this trade balance. So America has been consuming a lot more steel than it produces. And that ultimately means that the percentage of EAF capacity that you can get to in this market is near 100%, supported by primary line making DRI facilities. And you saw that in the capital allocation decisions. You saw that in the historical trends of the technologies over time. So we really believe there's this scrap opportunity in the market, which is not recognized by decarbonisation frameworks, which we need to recognize in a way that rewards the capital that's been allocated there. So if you skip the next slide, how am I on time, Dina?
You're fine.
Going good?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, great. Now, obviously, the future's uncertain. All forecasts are wrong. Some of them are helpful. That's how we think about it. But we also think about scenario analysis. And as you have this sort of trade barriers put around this market to enable it to invest into the future, we identified a number of features which we think will drive a growth in the production potential in this market over time. The first is potentially higher pricing in scrap supply. Second is scrap net trade, a reduction in scrap going abroad because of the value of it here in terms of producing steel. And the third is an increase in the direct reduced iron supply, which can be readily decarbonised, is aligned with the scenarios of the GSCC. So we see that, but we don't see that reflected in decarbonisation frameworks apart from in the GSCC. So if we skip on to the next one. Yeah, this just illustrates the point that basically steel scrap grows over time. That's key finding in the paper. So once we've done this very detailed modelling analysis, lots of numbers, we did a full scrap model, scrap slide, we became convinced that there were mechanisms that could expand scrap's role in decarbonising the steel industry in the US and in Europe. But that the current existing framework, such as that of responsible steel, did not allow that as a mechanism of decarbonisation. Now, yes, these frameworks, they're not necessarily fact, but if you take a technology neutral pathway, you're able to unlock innovation, unlock technology for that decarbonisation pathway. Whereas with responsible steel, you take a technology focused pathway, which is bifurcated in that way we saw with the tree, between the primary production and secondary production, but with no glide path over time. So it can lead you to promise yourself as being low carbon today, selling a future that you know you can't deliver. And so we saw that as a problem as investors. We really wanted to see that glide path. We wanted to see steel companies that were generating value through the transition, both through low-cost steel production, but through decarbonisation. And therefore, we thought the GSCC, we can endorse that as a pathway that we know will generate value, both from an equity perspective, but also from a climate perspective. If those two things are aligned, that's great. And so I'll leave you a final image, which is the industry itself. Admittedly, this is steel. The industry itself looks like it's coming this way down the track and splitting into two ways. However, we believe the GSCC helps us to go the other way, switch the frame and move back down the track towards convergence with our climate goals and with our financial performance. And that's why we're really happy today to endorse the standard as an investor, knowing that will drive value in the transition. So that's what I have to say.
You have for a few minutes of Q&A.
Yeah, sure. Fire away.
Any questions? Or not?
So you laid out a pathway and talked about scrap legalization, and cost into cascade effect. What do you think are both the barriers and the momentum in the US right now for the path you're modeling?
Well, so the momentum is primarily economic and capital. We know the capital is going towards these projects, and there is that momentum there. The barriers, I would say, are electricity supply. We've got enormous load growth due to the AI boom, and so getting access to cheap, clean, burning power is a real challenge for the sector, which is a large electricity consumer. The other barriers, I think, is actually definition of what low carbon steel needs. Like for low carbon steel to generate a competitive advantage, it needs to be walled off in terms of creating markets for just that type of product. So you need easy, clean procurement frameworks to help customers buy the low carbon steel in a way that's transparent. I think the final way is around capital markets. But clearly, in the North American market, they're doing a job. They're discounting that future. So I think that's a positive news story.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's good.
I'm really happy, Vicky Caramita, with Caramita. I'm very happy that you are supporting the GSCC. As far as we are concerned, and we are doing assurance work under various conditions. It's the only platform that truly looks at the results. And it doesn't have the wording and the repetition that so many other platforms have. So it is wonderful to see that you are in support of it.
Yeah, and I think something that I really didn't mention that I should have done is that transparency and comparability across geography is critical for investors that invest globally. So from our perspective, it really is that transparency and emissions boundary that is drawn around the steelmaking process, which we think is very coherent and comprehensive. That's the big benefit for us. So glad to hear you also feel the same.
Curious your advice or ideas for combating a lot of these false narratives. There's so many standards out there, just like Adina said. There's a lot of people calling things by a particular name, and they're nowhere near close to what they're calling. This is green steel. When you look at it, well, if you only measure one little thing, then your number looks really good, even though you left out 95% for all the carbon sources that you really need to count in your production processes. GSCC standard actually counts that, right? It's the most inclusive standard of all the carbon emissions pieces of scrap and various steelmaking processes around the world. So to that end, there's a lot of NGOs, right? There's a lot of other groups that somehow have sort of caught on to some of these standards that really aren't good for the environment. They really aren't good for advancing lower emissions. So the question is practically, how do you start to turn that? How do you go combat that narrative and say, guys, you really need to wake up, right? You really need to understand this.
It's interesting. It's a technological question. Is that those frameworks were really innovative at a time when there really wasn't the technological understanding that you could make a high quality flat products from EAF steel. I mean, Dave will definitely talk about it, but that technology question has been to some extent solved, though. Yeah, he'll talk about it. But firstly, so that's changed. We've had technological progress. The second thing is the fact that GSCC has been formed is good to show that there is something else up there, a new idea that we can add to this discussion. Previously, all other frameworks used the sliding scale, which reflects the fact that it's global scrap shortage. Scrap is globally scarce, but it's locally abundant. And so, in a global perspective, if you create your standard at a global level, then actually it's fair enough, probably, to say we don't have enough scrap. But it's definitely not fair in particular markets, particularly in the US and Europe, where we have these trade barriers, we have decarbonisation objectives, which will be achieved ahead of those in emerging markets. And so I think it's this understanding that decarbonisation frameworks need to be locally relevant and chosen to reflect the local reality.
around ASP, infrastructure connectivity. First of all, great presentation, but love to talk supply chain economics at some point. Kind of responding to combating false green steel labeling. So we work with American Society of Civil Engineers. We're trying to connect municipalities and owners together. So if there are guidelines that we can provide, we're going to try to do that. So anything you can share, we're kind of that funding. Yeah.
It's good to get some connections in the audience as well. Check on that over a mimosa or two. Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
Thank you so much for the presentation. Just building on to your comments about global scrap shortage as well as importance of local context. I think today's presentation very much focused on the US or North American context. I'm curious how you see this planning out globally. Do you think this is relevant on a global scale, or are you looking at other technologies?
Oh, actually, I mean, there is a really vast literature and really exciting technology space around decarbonising primary iron, for sure. The US has got really cheap gas, and some other areas do too, like the Middle East. And they're putting DRI capacity in, which can be readily decarbonised, whether it's through hydrogen or CCS. And then you've got some really exciting technologies around electrolysis, which might be another, like further in the future, but the potential way to decarbonise that primary iron making capacity. But at the overall industry level, the main drivers really is demand growth, and it's in the emerging markets. Demand growth is going to be basically satisfied by increase. So what we really need to do is show the way, generate the technology here that's going to be a cheaper process for new demand growth that comes in emerging markets. And that's why it's important that within the protection of trade barriers, we really push technology as fast as possible so that emerging markets have another option rather than the last interim capacity, which utilises their cheap coal resources and iron. And we need to give them better options, and then that should hopefully help to decarbonise the overall.
Great. Well, thank you, Charlie. Join me in thanking Charlie. And thank you for your endorsement. We're delighted that the investor community appreciates our approach to decarbonization in the steel sector, and we're looking forward to a partnership with Legal in general, and with you personally, and hopefully others in the investor community, because we do believe in this and we want to deliver that value for you as well as those climate goals. So now I'm going to ask Dave Miracle and Mel Hirsch and Nick Ellis to come up and join us for a panel. And we're going to let Charlie get a breather for a minute. But if everybody can join us up here, we've got our chairs. And then we'll continue the discussion.
I have to look out. I'm just sucked in.
I know. Magnificent. Up until this point, I've had my back to the window, but I will try to stay engaged in the conversation. I've already taken my pictures. It's all good. Great. Well, Nick, Mel, Dave, thanks for joining us, and Charlie for doing some double duty with us during this presentation. But I'm gonna let give Nick, Mel, and Dave actually a minute also to introduce themselves and their companies a little bit, and what they're doing in this space. But let me start with Nick and Mel, whoever wants to go first. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your company's sustainability journeys and what you as steel customers require from steel suppliers?
Sure, I'll go first. Hi, everybody. Thank you, Adina. Thank you to our host, and thank you to Kearney News for the magnificent space. My name is Mel Hirsch, and I'm a little hopped up on decongestant, so I have notes, and I'm making snorkeling noises, and I apologize.
It's my new favorite word. She told me this the other
Yeah, it's a technical word. Then I'm going to read from here. I actually want to just offer something too. Personally, from my past, I was previously involved in securing infrastructure and supply chain. And that really was a way to secure that energy and industrial space. And to do that would allow for safe and reliable sustainability dividends to actually be yielded, because otherwise people will revert back to other needs, to other energy sources. So that was something I did in my prior life. But I'm currently the director for partnerships and consortium at the nuclear company. We're a new startup, and we're looking at nuclear deployment and delivery, and we are delivering gigawatt scale power that's clean and reliable. And so obviously from our standpoint, there's a bit of a virtuous cycle here, and looking at how we address clean steel and sustainable steel so that it can support the generation of clean power, which can then also utilize sustainable steel. So we're very interested in what that looks like. And for the nuclear space, about 3/4 of the cost comes from actually developing steel, concrete, and construction overall. And so for us, at the nuclear company, we have expectations that our steel suppliers will meet the same standards that we hold ourselves to, and that's nuclear grade strength that will last generations. I'd have to say, I echo some of the comments that were made earlier, and in terms of transparency, that's something that we are really quite committed to. And so that we hope that our steel suppliers can provide full accounting of carbon emissions, so we know we can deliver sustainable plants that generate, once again, clean baseload power. And I would also add that as we rebuild a domestic nuclear fuel cycle, we're also trying to secure American supply chains. And we're prioritizing steel that will be manufactured by reliable partners here at home in the US. And finally, because we are building a fleet scale, we need suppliers who can grow with us, which is how we accelerate bringing power to the grid. So again, it's really about that virtuous cycle. And I thank you for an opportunity to be here today.
Yeah, great. Nick?
Yeah. Hey, morning all. Nick Ellis with Amazon. I've been with the company about 7 years. The last 5 years helping lead our investments through the Climate Pledge Fund in new technologies that can help us reach net zero by 2040. That's Amazon's commitment to neutralize our emissions, whether that be steel, concrete, fuels, EVs, and all the various supply things that we use to run our business. We work with vendors in a variety of ways. I'll list just a few because I think we'll get into them a little more in the coming hour here, but we view ourselves as a catalyst and a convener, first and foremost. We provide offtake for a lot of the big steel producers. I think sending that market signal is probably the most important thing we can do to say, hey, we care about it. We're willing to pay that premium and put it to good use. One of the first things we do before even making that commitment is to pilot and test that material. So for novel producers or new types of steel, we're an early adopter typically, and that will help us build confidence to say we can actually use this at scale in our whole supply chain. A couple of the other things we do are look to help with the book and claim and accounting of this steel. That's an area that I think still deserves more attention and probably will come for years to come. And then we're also investing just around the corner. So we have an investment in a company called Electrosteel based out of Boulder, Colorado. They're doing electrolysis to produce DRI. And this is a very low carbon intensity way to produce steel that we think is hugely promising for us, just as we look to scale up that supply. So a few different touch points, many different ways we're looking to work with folks. If you have ideas or anything you'd like to talk about after, I'd encourage you to find a minute. We're always looking for good ideas out there.
Yeah, so we're definitely going to expand on all of that. But Dave, as a steel company, talk a little bit about your strategy for decarbonization, and then also mention why you're doing it. Is it because of these customers wanting to work with you, to basically purchase the material you're doing it, or are there other drivers, or maybe it's both?
Yeah, so again, thank you for the opportunity. Dave Miracle, General Manager of Environmental Affairs and Sustainability for Nucor. 22 years with integrated steel production and 5 with circular production. So, what a great exhibit Nucor has, steel and steel products looking out the window of the Empire State Building, right? Everything from, One World Trade to One Vanderbilt.
Mets beat my Cubs last night. I don't want to talk about the Mets.
Yeah, let's
Stadium,
not
I'm sorry. You know, so, okay, Paul.
Yeah.
You know, LaGuardia, terminal expansion, so it's everywhere. And you think about, how did Nucor become the largest steel producer in the United States? It's a bet that Ken Iverson made in the 60s, who would have turned 100 a few days ago, by the way. And, it's a bet on circular steel production. And it really changed the world. I mean, there's probably not been a more significant decision made to decarbonize steel production than that decision he made to bet the company in the 1960s. And he most likely was not thinking about climate change in the 60s, but he was thinking about, I suspect, how to make steel in the most energy efficient way. How do we maximize the utilization of scrap? And Charlie's presentation I thought was great. The first big step was moving away from open hearths to blast furnaces. Imagine if we'd have had two standards that supported open hearths over blast furnaces, and then would we have made that step change? And now we're on to step change number two, moving to EAFs. But to your question, Adina, there's really two things in EAF production we have to focus on to further decarbonize. One is energy, of course, right? We need abundant, clean, cheap energy. We believe nuclear is going to be a big part of that. There's other routes too, but we are very excited to work with a nuclear company on that particular piece of it as well. The other is iron making. You cannot make high quality steel with just recycling scrap. You have to have virgin iron units. We do that, as Charlie mentioned, with DRI. It can be done with HBI. So what are those other things, though, that can bring us to a clean iron unit? And this partnership with Amazon and Electra, great opportunity, right? You can take very low grade iron units, essentially dissolve them and make fresh iron units without needing a blast furnace, without needing a DRI facility. That also takes lots of electricity, by the way. So you have to have that, that clean carbon-free electricity to be able to do that. Those are really the two segments that we're focused on, the energy piece and the clean iron making to make that next jump. Because if you have those two things, you're very close to net zero steel production at that point.
Thank you so much. Actually, you touched on not my next question, but my question after that. So I'm going to skip around just a little bit. My next question was actually going to be talking about let's have everybody participate in talking about partnerships. But since you brought in iron, that is going to be important. Charlie did note something that all of us in the steel world do understand is that circular steel making based on scrap will not be able to fulfill 100% demand in the foreseeable future. We understand that. We will need integrated steel making for a while. There are certain steel products, especially in the flat category, that even in the electric arc furnace require iron units. So maybe just to involve all of you, whoever wants to jump in first, how can partnerships, and Dave, you already touched on one so far between Nucor and the nuclear company. I don't know if you can elaborate. Maybe there's opportunities for Amazon, opportunities for the investor community to come into this. Talk about how partnerships can lead to cleaner iron in the future, even while this discussion also is focusing on advancements in recycling. Is there more you can say?
First shot at it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess for those of you not familiar, if you're making steel in an integrated facility here in the States, you actually use quite a bit of scrap. Some folks don't know that. You probably use like 20% scrap. In an EAF, you're going to use about 50%. So in terms of the metallurgy necessary to make, call it like exposed automotive, which is like the highest form of steel production, that can absolutely be done in an EAF. You just have to have those virgin iron units to go along with it to dilute the copper out that comes along with the scrap. Make a thick slab, roll down, and you can make your exposed hood for a BMW, Mercedes, or Toyota. So
Which makes it stronger to protect you in the car.
right. So whether you're making that iron with a blast furnace or you're making a DRI plant, like the metallurgy is the same. So why not use natural gas as that reducing agent as opposed to like coal, like at a blast furnace. So that's like at a very high level. ES can make all the steel and all the steel products that a blast furnace can make. You just have to have those virgin iron units from DRI or somewhere else to go along with it. So to expand a little bit more on Electra, we talk to customers that are like huge spectrum in terms of their knowledge and understanding of sustainability, right? So over here, it can be very high level and just educating them on this side of the spectrum, and on the other side, like they're educating us, right? And the partnership that we have with Amazon really pushed me like to think bigger. And Dan Gross, the climate pledge for Amazon, did call us with this opportunity for Electra, and I suspect that does not happen without the partnership between Nucor and Amazon. And there's a great chance that ends up being the solving that Rubik's Cube, how you get to net zero quickly. So when you talk about partnerships between customers and suppliers, that was just Amazon trying to understand more about our business and what it takes to decarbonize, and Nucor trying to understand Amazon, what they're trying to accomplish. So it's just a great example of how just that engagement, those conversations could lead to major dividends in the future.
From an investor perspective, those types of partnerships are really valuable for us because they're option value in the future. So if Electra's technology is the winner, and Nucor's got a front row seat at it with an early adopter like Amazon, you can value that today in terms of the price that you might want to pay for the equity of a business, because Nucor demonstrates that by looking at technology through time, it's there for the long run and it's there for growth. So you can value it as a growth company and not as a runoff type business. So that's enormously valuable for us from an investor side. But anyway.
I think similarly, just as an investor, we think a lot about the composition of the cap table, the capitalization table of these companies when we put money in. And to me, it's always an important signal where we have an established industry leader like Nucor come in and participate in a company, because then to Charlie's point, we've really answered a lot of the investor questions. We have offtake represented by Amazon, we have the production interest represented by Nucor, and then you have this novel technology represented by Electra that we're all publicly agreeing could be disruptive and transformative. So to me, I think it's a lot about the convening, bringing in the right stakeholders early on. I'm actually, just to put something provocative out there, I'm surprised I don't see more corporates moving. And most of it points back to the supply-demand economics that we see coming, which is there is a shortage of clean steel coming onto the market if you believe the corporate demand is real in 5 and 10 and 20 years. I'd actually be curious to hear from folks when we get to the Q&A, why aren't more corporations moving more forcefully on this? Because a lot of those options are being reserved today by folks like Nucor or Amazon. And so it's been a head scratcher for me. I see this across hydrogen projects. I see it across cement projects. I see it across EVs. And there's just not as much motion as you would think. Again, probably a topic for good debate as we get a little deeper in, but we're always looking for those partnerships and opportunities where you do see those clear signals coming through.
Yeah. I'm just going to add something. I mean, I don't need to echo what everybody has said, but it's really about confidence building and unlocking trust, not just amongst the entities involved in the partnership, but with the public, too, that there is a commitment that stands behind this, mutually reinforcing. And I think the more you can have these ecosystems that are operating together, the more confidence will be potentially in the market to look at these things, the more people will actually start looking at how they can move forward and not be seen as it being, and this kind of goes to one of the other things you were going to talk about, an either or. It's not an either. You can work together in tandem to drive down costs, to drive down carbon emissions, and you could do that in a way that brings really good, mutually beneficial.
Yeah, and this is actually a great segue of a question that I have teed up, which is, there are a number of companies, especially in Europe, in particular, one very large company that is already publicly saying that they don't think they're going to meet their 2030 targets. And they're blaming market conditions or the economics. And, it's the low carbon transition does take time. It takes effort, and certainly it's costly. And market conditions are different in different regions. And there's certainly a wide range of policies, regulations and market instruments that support the transition, but also can create additional administrative burdens. So how do we balance, the economics of the transition? We at the GSCC have made a very, very ambitious commitment, and not a single one of our members have canceled any of their projects, have not backed off on any of their commitments. There is cost, and they are bearing the cost. But we are seeing members of some of the other programs having to stay back, or they remain members of those other programs because the ambition is a little bit less. So how do we balance all of this, knowing it's still important, but how do you deal with some of that cost, or how do you do cost sharing, or how do you draw on partnerships to do that?
I'll give a quick response, and I'm curious if it actually aligns with a lot of the other panels. I think this concept of balancing is the wrong way to think about it. It feels like a hedging strategy. And my observation is hedging is a losing strategy in this game. We know the capital requirements are high. And so I think it's really about aggregating enough capital on the front end of the equation, making sure that it's ready in significant quantum, that we can deploy it at affordable cost. So I think that's an all-in strategy, whether it's by corporates or producers, but we got to put our money where our mouth is. And then I think the backside of that is I trust the production process will decarbonize steel from, a ton to half a ton to barely a ton of CO2 equivalent. But the offtake needs to be there as well. And so I think if you can clarify those two things in the market, especially in the next 5 years, seems to be this critical period where we're either going to really all tip in and stop hedging and commit and start buying, or we do back off. And then, I don't think it's a balancing act. I think it's a losing act at that point in time. So to me, we've got to double down. Again, capital has to increase by a quantum. Right? We saw $100 billion by NVIDIA going to OpenAI earlier this week. That was about the right size in my mind that we need to aggregate just for steel transformation. Probably, 2-3x that when we look beyond just the North American market. Where is that capital today? And then where are those offtake commitments that will actually put that steel to good use? To me, again, we have to go all in. There is no balance here. It's really just a binary. Are we doing it or not?
I think that's fantastic assessment of it. And as you think about allocating capital, there is this just global overcapacity problem where if you're adding cost to your system on something compared to the current system, which has economies of scale, which you're never going to get to compete to. So you need process change that will bring the cost down to compete with that. But you also, I think, need a pricing environment that you can trust over the longer term. So I think this push towards trade barriers, whether it's the carbon border adjustment in Europe or whether it's the Section 232 in the US, what that does is it creates the pricing environment that gives the confidence to invest the sorts of sums of money that you're talking about to get that cost cut down, get that technology out there. Interested here.
Again, for the nuclear company, if we take the approach that we're really embracing, which is to build gigawatt scale power, which can occur in a fleet scale approach, that should help to lower the per unit cost of our materials. And that's a demand signal, that drives the need for suppliers to meet the standards that we're looking for. And so that repetition drives efficiency that will ultimately help us build faster, cheaper, and cleaner. But like what Nick said, it has to be all in. So we talk about the need for clean and firm power, but people are feeling a little sticker shock when they look at nuclear. And the idea is to drive down that cost curve over time. Again, the more you can rinse and repeat what you're doing and have proven designs and show what you can do and make efficiencies in scheduling and construction costs. And then obviously to also not compromise on your supply dependencies and not have to compromise on your sustainability requirements. you can move things forward.
Mhm.
But it is a jumping in point. You have to jump in. So I fully agree with you. And there is a lot of, dipping your toe in the water. Now, where you may need to dip your toe in the water, which is similar to what you're doing on a smaller scale with some of your R&D investments, is there still has to be proven technologies. So we still have to demonstrate some technologies that haven't yet made it onto the market, but others that have been proven, what's stopping us from moving forward at full speed.
Yeah.
So I do agree with what Nick said.
Yeah. Anything to add?
Yeah, I think overall, I mean, the supply chain will ultimately adjust to the customer expectation, right? I mean, that's the way it will roll. I think we're a ways away from, you go order food at a restaurant, you see the calorie count, and you adjust your decision making, and maybe you don't. Are we going to be a point to where an automobile purchaser looks at the LCA on this vehicle versus that? I don't know. I think we're ways away from that. But I do think there are leaders like Amazon, like the nuclear company, that will drive a certain segment of the steel production, where it needs to go with these climate goals. Because the last thing that we can do is bake in some cost model that is then undercut with imports that are labeled green. And we'll talk about the sliding scale in a little bit. That's just the piece that we have to continually, be mindful of, because we obviously have to remain profitable.
Are we going to talk about that? I wasn't going to ask about it. Well, you've talked a little bit about, that green premium, which, is really an air quote sort of thing. What does that really mean? What's that price point? And I'm not sure if I'm going to ask this question to get a direct answer, but probably not to get a direct answer, which is fine. But when does the green premium become just the price? Whether that's the price of raw materials, maybe it's the energy from whatever source that energy comes from. Maybe it's the steel product itself, the low emission steel product, or maybe it's at the vehicle level or the building itself. I don't know in modeling if we know when in the future when the price actually is no longer a premium, but it's just the price. I wanted to try to throw that out there.
It's really interesting. I think there's obviously certain customer segments that have a willingness to pay. And as you get towards larger volumes, that willingness to pay goes down. And really we're asking at what cost point can we get technologies such that everyone's willing to pay? Certainly everyone would be willing to pay if the lower carbon technology was cheaper than the high carbon. That's the floor basically, is a price premium of zero. But actually you can have customers who are willing to pay, and that can flow through the supply chain in, for example, the auto sector. So that steel is actually a small percentage of the cost of a car. And so the percentage to pay, the willingness to pay on steel might actually be quite high as a proportion of the cost of that product. Because you're selling a car for $80,000, the steel that goes into it is a small fraction of that. So that's something. There's certain segments where you might pay more, and then of course as it plays out, there's obviously regulators that can sort of force you to pay, and so that's what's happening in Europe. Is you have the EU ETS, which is the emissions trading system, and the shielding that steel companies are getting is rolling off of it and forcing them to face the costs of carbon in their cost of goods sold. So that's going to reduce their margin over time and sort of almost force them up the cost curve and force consumers to pay that price. So yeah, I think that ultimately regulation would be the one that gets it all the way there. But actually, there will be consumer segments where price premiums could be significant. And yeah, I don't know what your perspective is,
Anybody
David.
else?
What you see?
Anybody else want to comment?
The only thing I would add is it's not today, but it's when you can negotiate with the supplier to reach that parity. So each one of these offtake agreements that I've seen, at least, they're fairly bespoke, and I think there's a lot of trust that has to be on both sides to actually agree to a price that we think makes sense given all the uncertainty at the regulatory level, at the raw materials level. Like, these are not certainties as we look ahead. If anything, there's probably more question marks around a lot of them than there were even a year or two ago. So I think a lot of it comes down to like, who are the counterparties that are negotiating that? And where you have two really big credible counterparties, you know, pricing, I think, is not the same necessarily or as sticky as you might think. And some of that, it's back to just the signaling effect of giving them confidence that we can use 1 million, 2 million, 10 million tons of steel a year, and them saying suddenly, hey, actually, if you can take that much, we can lower the price in ways that we hadn't previously thought. So I do think it's a bit case by case. You know, it may not be there today, but I would expect that it will get there sooner than many people, I think, are thinking 20 years out, right? 25 years out till we see that price parity. I would be surprised if it actually took that long.
Yeah, I mean, 30,000 foot view, when it's become part of the price, I think it's when you're required to maximize the usage of scrap, and when you don't have any other choices in terms of the energy you're using to make that steel, right?
Yeah.
That's a much broader question, is when is the grid, you know, completely cleaned up, and when, you know, so that my guess is that's when it's actually a part of the price. Because
Sure.
if steel producers have choices to go a dirtier route. If it's cheaper, they will sometimes tend to go that way.
Yeah, yeah. All right, who is really in the driver's seat for decarbonization across the supply chain? Is it the suppliers? But which suppliers? Like, is it the raw material suppliers driving it, or is it like the steel companies supplying to, let's say, the nuclear company who's building infrastructure, or Amazon is building infrastructure? Or is it demand driven? But like, which demand driven? Like, is it, you know, again, Amazon who's trying to build fulfillment centers, but it might also be the consumers who keep buying things off of Amazon, so you need more fulfillment centers. Who's in the driver's seat for decarbonization?
I think the whole sector has to deliver it, right? You need all the way through the supply chain. So the customers are going to be providing that sort of price signal. Then you have the producers that need to ultimately do the investments to get that lower carbon emissions out there. You've got consultants who are going to help you to measure and report on that carbon and accredit it. You've got GSCC, which is sitting there as a kind of aggregation framework. It's a whole supply chain, whole industry challenge. And I think the whole industry is involved in the solution. So that's really not an answer to your question, is it? So I don't know if anyone's got.
I agree with you. I think it's carpool. I think we're switching drivers every couple hours or something. Yeah. So I don't think it's any one of us, right? It's got to be driven by you know, market demand and customers and support from policy and, you know, steel producers like Nucor that have always strived to do the right thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's an industrial ecosystem, and we talked about that virtuous cycle. We talked about the carpool analogy, and I also, you know, in certain stages, when you have producers that are going to actually stick themselves out there and set it as a standard, everybody else is just going to follow suit. And so, you're just going to get there at some point. It's not going to be aspirational. It's going to be, you know, the expectation. And for us, you know, it's if you're a supplier that's investing in new technology, or even what you're doing, and a developer that's bringing clean power to the grid, or a customer signing a long-term offtake contract, we all have a role to play, because we can't do it alone. We're not self-performing, and we're not vertically integrated to provide all of these services. So we have to rely on each other to do that for a wider value chain. Yeah, it's an all of the above.
You want to add? No? Okay. Actually, I'm delighted by the answer. I had this question teed up like a week or two ago, but we were at an event yesterday where the question came up, and somebody came out with the answer like, oh no, it's only buyer driven. And I was so disappointed by that answer that I'm really actually happy about this. My last question before we open up to Q&A is a shameless plug for the GSCC. So Charlie and Dave are going to help me do a commercial. Why'd you guys join the GSCC?
You want to start? I think
you got plenty of choice. Why are you doing it? Although Charlie kind of talked about it a little
25 minutes.
But I'm going to make Dave do it.
Value creation.
You get 30 seconds.
Yeah, so this is the maybe the entertaining part of the segment. So get your popcorn ready.
Yeah,
So,
this is where you can bring up your favorite topic.
right. So at the end of the day, as Charlie mentioned in his presentation, there was a lot of movement abroad for this sliding scale, and we think Nucor, there's just no place for it, at least here in the United States, where there's abundant supply of scrap. So that sliding scale piece should not be applied to procurement decisions in the U.S. And how I like the analogy I like to use, I guess the is here in New York, and I love to play golf. I'm not good at all. So let's just assume my handicap's 20, and it's probably worse than that. But if I went one-on-one against Scotty Scheffler and he beats me by 19 strokes, I can then apply my 20 handicap and I win, right? That does not mean I'm a better golfer than Scotty Scheffler. So, okay, what are you talking about right now? But like, that's what the sliding scale is. Okay, it's a way to rebrand integrated steel production as green. It's simply a handicap. It's not. Make steel, great, but just don't call it green, because it turns out it's a lot easier to rebrand green than it is to make the billions of dollars in investments that's necessary to migrate over to that circular steel production. And you know, a situation where, as I recall, I think if you're not recycling anything, you get maybe 2.6 tons of greenhouse gases, and if you recycle 100%, you get maybe a half a ton. So, you know, if you're buying, call it 1 million tons of rebar from Nucor, there's a call it a half, 500,000 tons of greenhouse gases associated with that. If you're buying it from an integrated producer overseas, like there's 2.6 million tons of greenhouse gases associated with that. But yet both could be considered green under this sliding scale scheme. So very long-winded way of answering. Really, the GSCC was formed to sort of take that piece out of the equation, especially in economies like the US and the EU, per Charlie's discussion earlier, where scrap's abundant. Undeveloped economies, that's potentially a different discussion. Again, I think the question you could ask is, can the world afford for those economies to develop the same way, we did in the 30s and the 40s? Not sure the answer to that. But what I do know is there's plenty of scrap in the US to focus our steel production solely on the circular.
And thank you for asking why I took my job as executive director of the GSCC, is because I'm inspired by the stories of all of our members that they're simply cutting emissions and not wanting to go through this, branding of something. So anyway, we have about 10 minutes. Does anybody have questions for any of our panelists?
I'll fill the void
Yeah.
while people are mulling. I like what you just said there, but in terms of transitional economies, I think there's a real opportunity for actually demonstrating to those economies that you can leapfrog. And you're seeing a lot of those countries anyway leapfrogging technology, and so they're even surpassing where we are in certain things with the latest and greatest. And so why not? I mean, there is a role to set the stage and say you can start here. And I think it's truly an opportunity. Just overall.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Questions? Yeah, Vicky.
A wonderful, Vicky Caramida, again, wonderful discussion. And I could not stop thinking throughout the various answers that really, I believe every panelist brought up the issue that it is the business case, it is the economic issue that really is driving sustainability. And I think for many years, we have gone the opposite. We are looking at the sustainability issues without looking at the financial issues. And that is an approach without a foundation. So I'm really glad that today's discussion is really focusing on the financial aspects of it. Without financial strength, nothing is going to work.
Agreed.
Any reaction? One of my favorite talking points that several of my members use is that, I forgot how it's couched, but it's something like decarbonization is just good business. And that, you know, the electric arc furnace technology, especially when it took off in the 60s, you know, the primary purpose was about efficiency. By the way, I finally visited my first integrated mill. I went to POSCO in Korea, and it gave me a whole new meaning of the term mini mill, because that thing was massive. But you know, so you create these mini mills. It's a smaller footprint. It uses less energy. It uses less raw materials. You do have fewer employees. So there's, you know, and all in all, you make the same amount of steel. You're still making the same product, but you're using less. And there's which means it's less cost. Oh no, by the way, you're also emitting less emissions. And so it's just good business, like overall. And I've really kept that to heart. And I say it all the time when I talk to people. So, any other questions?
Maggie Ferraro, Climate Imperative. I noticed, Charlie, you had on your slides gas TRI, and there's been a lot of talk about Electra. So I'm wondering, maybe this is a question for you, Dave, but if anyone has comments about the role, if any, you see hydrogen playing in the decarbonization of
Question.
iron making.
You want to take a shot?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, so in electric arc furnace steel production, you know, electricity is the driver, not so much natural gas. But when it comes to DRI, HBI, certainly natural gas is the is the driver. So the cost of hydrogen at the moment, like green hydrogen, is significantly higher than natural gas. So once those prices come down, I think it certainly presents an opportunity. And I think with the nuclear company, for instance, if a small modular nuclear reactor was that driver, you can, I don't know, is it pink hydrogen?
Yeah.
I forget the colors. So, yeah, so I mean, I think there is certainly imagine that scenario, right, where you've got a modular nuclear reactor next to a DRI plant that's supplying the, reducing energy to make that DRI. It's also, that power plant supplying the AF next door. I mean, that you can see that being a potential as well. And, same thing with Electra, if that answers your question.
Yeah, they call hydrogen the Swiss Army knife of the transition because it does everything. It
Yeah.
can be an energy carrier, it can be a reducing agent, it can be anything. But actually, interestingly, in Europe, they're already doing it. So there's it used to be called H2 green steel, but it's now called Stegra. And they basically plugged an electrolyzer into a dam hydroelectric plant, super cheap electricity in the far north of, I believe, Sweden. And then what they're doing is they put a DRI facility to use that cheap hydrogen. And so, yeah, I think hydrogen's a really important, can play a really important role. But to get cheap hydrogen is very geographically specific. So you've got to have that really cheap electricity to produce the hydrogen, and then you've also got to have the iron ore to do the DRI. And that iron ore needs to be quite special in that it needs to be much higher grade typically than what you put into an integrated facility. So yeah, geographically specific, but still important.
Did you say Stegra?
Yeah.
So Microsoft just announced a purchasing commitment with them yesterday.
Oh.
For renewable energy and green hydrogen steel for their data centers, which was
Hot off the press.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's wild. So they were marketing it as like the market signal but it was interesting. I mean, they're going to bring it to the U.S. from there. So I don't know how that's
Transport.
compares, but
Yeah.
They typically at a premium of around $400 a ton for that.
But that price sensitivity is important, especially with the energy piece, because Salzgitter also announced within the last few days that they're having to, that there's delays with some of their hydrogen plants in Germany. So, and we've seen other hydrogen plants canceled or delayed, you know, so it really is super regional sensitive. Other questions?
Yeah, so Charlie, you raised a great point that the automaker has a much higher willingness to pay because fortunately steel is a lower portion of the cost of the car. But for the steel producer, that's a commodity industry, this is a much bigger cost. And so have you, Amazon or others looked at a contract for difference model to help bridge that willingness to pay and spread the cost across the value chain?
That's a really interesting idea.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we have no firm conclusions yet, but I think exactly that insight. If we are not the sole beneficiary of green steel, there's a lot of servers, racks, just inside our data centers produced by another vendor or many other vendors. So a lot of it has just been speaking with them about, hey, what is your roadmap? What is your willingness to pay? And then starting to understand, like, how far apart are we? I agree, that could be a good mechanism. Yeah.
Our project management team and our procurement folks are looking at that, but I would have to say the same thing. I don't have, I can't answer on their behalf. I don't pretend.
There's all kinds of fascinating ways this market could go. You might not need to transport the steel if you have credits. So you could create the green steel, put it in something in Sweden, but then take the credit to the US without needing to transport it. This involves obviously market design and trust, like you're saying. But we don't necessarily need the physical steel to get to the data center. You could do it through a crediting system. We've seen that in other markets.
Maybe just important to emphasize, I know only about one automaker in Sweden that's a green premium. American automakers will say to you that they won't pay even $1 green premium. So that's a valid question.
Yeah, that just demonstrates the importance of, I guess, in Europe, is regulatory
Yes.
willingness to pay.
Exactly. So there is a lot of segmentation between different markets, different geographies, and I think that we need to think about organization of the mastics of the entire supply chain. So you can produce green steel from green iron in the United States using raw material in the United States, using steel mills in the United States, and to supply it to their customers in the United States without green premium. So there are ways to do that.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
That's the goal.
Yeah, just going back to the stagger on Microsoft deal, that also includes a portion of EAC purchases. And Nick, you were mentioning earlier book and claim and this market-based mechanisms and the benefits of this market-based mechanisms to aggregate demand are clear to me. But I was wondering if you see any risks or challenges of this book and claim or market-based mechanisms.
Yeah, all the classic ones. So double counting, just making sure we truly can account for the provenance of that steel and, have certainty on what the reduction was. And EAC's environmental attribute credits are essentially the separation of the commodity and the environmental credit. And to us as Amazon, it's a very valuable mechanism back to that supply chain. And you think about how many folks need to participate. Not everybody wants to buy off on that EAC straight away, but if you can separate it, you may be able to allocate it to specific partners and players along the value chain. So I see it as almost essential. I don't know that every consumer of steel wants that green steel. Again, there's a lot of local markets and dynamics here that are going to dictate who can get what, just because the cost of shipping it is prohibitive. So we have to find a way, I think, to separate that environmental attribute from that core commodity. And then, yeah, it does open up a number of different conversations about where it can go, as long as it's done right. My comment was that book and claim mechanism still isn't clear, at least to us, right? We're spending time week in, week out. A couple of my colleagues are here. If you want to talk with them about, how we think about it, we can get to the nitty gritty. It's complicated. It will take probably 2 more years, is my guess, before we have a lot of certainty that at least Amazon would attest that it's a green attribute, but I do see it as a key enabler.
you have a comment? Or?
Yeah, I feel similarly. It could be a bit of a slippery slope. You got to make sure that all the counting's right and verified. We offer a product called Econic that essentially takes green electrons from PPAs that we've invested in, and then apply that to our. So there's some of that we do, but to me, that still feels like a very short-term bridge solution to where we're ultimately trying to get to where all of steel production by 2050 is net zero. That's my 2 cents on it.
Yeah, I think, one of the cornerstones of the GSCC, and then we're going to wrap it up because we know this is a busy week for everybody. But, one of the cornerstones of the GSCC is transparency. And I think when you're looking at book and claim programs, I think as long as there's enough transparency for people to understand, those that are participating in the program to understand that separation of the credit itself from the product, and how is the company that may be taking the credit, but really how are they consuming the steel, I think has to be really, really studied well. I'm aware of a scenario where a company may purchase the credit, and in fact, they may be purchasing futures. And then they're just buying from a local steel producer that the steel itself actually is not low emission. And because they're buying future credits, that company from whom they're buying the credits may actually be selling their low emission steel on the open market. And another company will buy the steel. They don't get the credit per se, but they reputationally can go around and saying, oh, I bought my steel from company X, and everybody knows that company X only makes low emission steel. So reputationally, they'll get pride of having purchased it. Whereas the first company, actually incorporated really high emission steel in their building. So I have some healthy skepticism. As long as everything is very transparent and we really understand how those participating are using the credits and what are they actually consuming and how all of this works. And I'm still in learning mode and I have an open mind. So I'm still learning. But anyway, I think that just as long as those transparency pieces are in place and you can really read up on the data, I think it's important.
Yeah. My only quick comment there is I think that's an extremely high risk game that will quickly catch you in a corner, because folks like us are going to ask for the EPD and take a look at the LCA. And the moment you lose trust with us, that contract's going away. So my question would be, why are you playing that game when there are credible ways to go about it? And this is just a bad actor phenomenon that is endemic right out there. Like there's always going to be someone who's going to try and skirt the rules. I just don't think it gets you that far. So my view is, as we get more educated and folks start to realize that it's really hard to hide today, my guess is that game will go away quickly, but for sure there will be some opportunists out there.
Yeah. Well, Nick, Mel, Dave, and Charlie, thank you so much for a great conversation, and thanks to the audience for your interactions, your questions. And I really appreciate you all being here. So just a reminder, we have gifts for you. Please take one. Honestly, they have purpose, and they're a demonstration of two of our members' commitment to decarbonization. So they are truly for you to take. They're, one of them is a little heavy, but it's heavy with responsibility. And we have truly plenty of food and drinks. And at some point, Carney will kick us out, but I do want to, I am here to treat you to a little bit of breakfast before you move on to your next Climate Week event. But thank you so much for joining, and thank you to all of you online for also joining this great discussion. And you recognize you because
everybody else was. So we were at the series.